I was raised by the Sammamish River on the land of Coast Salish peoples. This is a bit east of Seattle, and my ancestors are from the Tamjin River in Korea. So it goes without saying that I'm a guest here in Hawaii, and this leads me to a disclaimer that I'm coming to today's meeting not as an expert to dispense information, but to humbly offer ike that I've gathered and that has been shared with me from people with much more experience who have been doing this work for generations. And grateful to have the opportunity to introduce these sensitive ideas. And I'm very open to learning. I welcome constructive criticism and correction. So, like I said, please drop things in the chat as you go. I'm sure you all have, great mana'o to share. So, a bit about why I care about this issue. The short story is I was an 18-year-old college student in New York City. I was witnessing the active gentrification of Harlem and felt the injustice of people being displaced from their homes very deeply. So, kind of immediately recognized my kuleana to learn more about how the system of real estate development works so I could fight back against displacement everywhere, which led me to study architecture at Columbia University. So I began working on projects to design restrooms for trans and non-binary people like myself. I was working on a campaign to abolish the largest jail in the country, and then began starting to work on nonprofit housing developments. So I kept on zooming out in scale and following the thread all the way back to land rights. And as many of us know, it all comes back to the ʻāina. So I first moved to Hawaii 7 years ago and was encouraged meeting people here with a similar appetite to go to the roots rather than treating symptoms. And to paraphrase Indigenous Moody activist Lilla Watson, I feel that my own liberation is bound up in the liberation of the ʻāina here as well as everywhere. So most of today is going to be me sharing insights from this ʻāina Summit that Rain mentioned, which was an extremely impactful experience. It felt like a deep fulfillment of kuleana. It was humbling and ceremonial, and it was intergenerational. There were activists like Uncle Walter Riddy who have been in this fight since the 1970s, and there was a solidarity between activists, elected officials, lawyers, real estate professionals, finance professionals, academics, generational residents, as well as leaders from Aotearoa and Turtle Island, which I'll share insights from. At the end of the summit, we had a gratitude circle and we talked about what we're leaving behind and what we're taking with us. And I said that what I was leaving behind was loneliness, and that I was able to find other people devoted to this movement, and that what I was taking with me is a map that leads back to this movement. So we were invited to kind of share what we learned there and bring it back to form coalitions in our own island communities to keep the momentum going. So today is my attempt to kind of do right by this charge. So the agenda for today is going to be an introduction that kind of shares about my connection to vibrance and housing justice and land rights. We'll talk about definitions of what is land back or ʻāina back. We'll talk about the ʻāina back summit that I just mentioned, who came, what was discussed, what were the lessons learned, and then we'll turn the attention to our island of what does ʻāina back look like here. Let's look at some case studies of how this has already been happening and connect it specifically to the affordable housing movement. And then we'll close for Q&A. And Rain, this is still coming through okay. You're not seeing my notes. Okay, cool. So I think the first is the connection with Vibrant. So on the invitation of Vibrant Hawaii and Janice, I served as project lead for the Owaka Artist Fellowship this year, designing and leading a curriculum for a cohort of 12 emerging artists, open to all Hawaii Island-based creatives age 18 to 28. So this program had fellows participate in gatherings, including workshops with 12 different instructors, sharing skills on business and wellness, supplemented by talk stories and enriching activities with local artists to support these young artists in becoming professionals. So uh, Fellows projects represented many mediums, from screen acting to choreography to environmental art to kappa and filmmaking to native plant dyes and mural making, and all the fellows got to present their works in Hilo at the Wailoa Arts Center at the end of May. So that's kind of how I've been mainly connected to Vibrant, and a bit on my work on housing justice and land rights. I've worked with several organizations that kind of inform my perspective on ʻāina back, many organizations in Turtle Island. So This group, Friends of Gadsden Creek, is a grassroots campaign that I've been organizing with since 2019 in Charleston, South Carolina, that's opposing the largest real estate development in the city's history that would accelerate a century-long pattern of environmental racism and gentrification in a historic Black community known as Gadsden Green. So the threat here is filling in and destroying what remains of a tidal creek, the last one on the peninsula, 100 acres of which have already been filled in to create land for profit. So this campaign began with a critical history of the city's history of injustice, from urban renewal to racially segregated public housing, and demands that those who have been most impacted play an active role in imagining alternative futures for self-determination, or what we might call ʻēa here. So for us, this meant kind of doing accounting homework, looking at the crimes the city had committed over the years, and formulating a counter proposal that would revitalize the creek and also provide reparations in the form of housing for the Gadsden Green community. So we found success in the court of public opinion, went on to sue and file lawsuits against several state agencies and the real estate developer, which went all the way to the South Carolina Supreme Court and helped elect a mayor who's now committed to saving the creek. So now we have a seat at the table. We're now kind of in negotiations phases. So I'm bringing some of this experience back here. I've also been working on writing, research, and lectures on real estate activism, housing justice, and land rights, conducting site visits to intentional communities and land trusts across the country, including some essays for Columbia's Graduate School of Architecture, and a condensed version of my findings called Nine Profiles of Real Estate Activists, which you can find pretty easily, and taught a seminar at Kent State University called Non-Compliance Activist Design Approaches, that led to some lectures around kind of cooperative land projects and both learning from the achievements and the harms that have been inflicted by intentional communities, communes, and eco-villages across the decades. Locally, I've been working to build Pilina with individuals and organizations aligned with the Aloha ʻāina, food sovereignty, and housing justice movements. So this has been a process of meeting individuals and orgs and contributing the best way I can. That might just mean shoveling lepo or clearing invasive species or planting canoe crops, and in other cases, helping support with historical research or site planning and mapping. So some of these orgs that I'm a huge fan of or have a crush on are kind of listed on the right-hand side here. And we have so many amazing ʻāina orgs here on Hawaiʻi Island. So this leads me to the main topic of today. What is land back and what is ʻāina back? So one could argue that land back is as old as colonialism is, as indigenous people have always challenged land theft as an illegitimate practice. But this actual term started to become more popular in 2020 at Mount Rushmore, where there were protests demanding that this monument be closed and that all public lands in the Black Hills be returned to the Lakota people. So the NDN Collective at that time launched the official Land Back movement on their website on Indigenous Peoples Day. So that was almost exactly 5 years ago in 2020. So out of that came the ʻāina Back movement of people in Hawaii feeling solidarity with this momentum happening on the mainland. And I think it's important to note that there's no official definition. There's no one central organization that's coining or owning this term. Obviously, the struggle for ʻāina here is similar but different than Native Americans. From treaties to federal recognition to reservations, there are differences, right? So I think a curious question is how is ʻāina Back similar or different than other long-standing frameworks like Aloha ʻāina, ʻēa, or what we're hearing these days, hoʻi hoʻi ʻāina, land back. I think what's useful to ask is who is taking the land or ʻāina back from who? Or is it more about are we restoring the land back to how things were before and before what, right? So we've likely heard the phrase keep Hawaiian lands in Hawaiian hands. So this might look different for different people. It might mean asserting sovereignty by occupying and reclaiming government lands. For others, it might be fundraising to purchase parcels listed on the market. For others, it might be researching genealogical records to make ancestral claims on deeds for Kuleana lands. I think what I've learned is there's no single definition, and that ʻāina Back as a term, regardless of how you define it or achieve it, is just a starting point to begin discussing a shared goal, which is a return to land tenure or ahupua'a systems before private property was introduced to Hawaii during the Mahele in 1848. So, restoring or going back to right relations between people and the ʻāina, escaping a real estate system that sells land to the highest bidder and extracts profit from it and benefits the few over the many, which has resulted in the devastation of the ʻāina that we know, right? Our bodies of water, animal, and plant life. So in Hawaii, I'm seeing land trusts as the most prominent vehicle to which we've been using as a tool to permanently protect land. But I've noticed that much of it is around conservation and largely leaves out housing, which is the focus of this coalition. So that's kind of what I'm interested to talk about. And on the right-hand side here, you see headlines. This is already from 3 or 4 years ago of, this is a movement that's happening. Hundreds of thousands of acres are being returned to Native communities daily. So it's a question of, how are we going to do this here? Or how is this already how's it maybe different here? So I think based on my research, these are the conclusions that I see people in the movement coming to in Hawaii. So one, the harm. It's largely documented that Hawaii was illegally overthrown by the United States, documented in the Apology Resolution of 1993, seizing the land from its original stewards. So without rehearsing the traumatic histories that we're now familiar with, as of this year, we know 55% of Hawaiians live out of state, many due to the unaffordable real estate prices, with 15,000 more leaving each year. So between the government, corporations, and billionaires, I think we can say that the majority of Hawaiian lands are not stewarded by Hawaiian hands, which has had devastating consequences. Two, we know the status quo isn't working. There are many government and nonprofit efforts to promote housing for Hawaiians and natural conservation, but many would argue that it's not happening fast enough or in a transformative enough way to account for this massive harm. The Department for Hawaiian Homelands, who was charged to distribute 200,000 acres in 1920, is continuing to do this work, and 24,000 Hawaiians are on that wait list. 2,000 have died waiting on that list, and many more don't qualify due to the controversial blood quantum requirement. So for the housing that is available on the private real estate market, it's largely unaffordable. It's also an issue of policy, right? 1 in 7 homes are vacant, many used as vacation homes, others used as short-term vacation rentals instead of housing for Hawaiians and generational residents, which if you look back at the recordings for Housing Coalition videos, we kind of say over and over again, we know that these are the issues. So what is the conclusion? Many are coming to the conclusion that we must return the ʻāina. So that prior to the Mahele, Hawaiians did not treat land as a commodity to be bought and sold, but instead as a commons to be collectively stewarded and revered. So how do we return to these principles that could restore ecological and societal balance? And what I'm hearing is that we need to amplify existing models. So people that are already doing this amazing change from the inside, guiding government agencies, nonprofits and conservation and community development. And we need to grow alternative models. Who are some people that are better posed to work maybe from the outside of the system, amplifying grassroots or experimental models, some of which I'll share shortly, but also these new organizations like the Molokai Heritage Trust being born, every year, housing cooperatives that are being created. So on the right-hand side, you can see the Land Back Bill. This was just in January. We know that these military leases are set to expire very soon, and there was a proposal to create an Aloha ʻāina land trust to rehabilitate and manage the lands that have been desecrated by the military over the years. So while this bill didn't pass, we can already see that this is coming into legislation now. This is a movement that's not stopping. So how can we, as people invested in the kind of housing industry, support this movement? So that leads me to the ʻāina Summit, which over 5 days in July in Oahu brought together people and organizations across the Pai'aina committed to addressing this challenge and strategizing. So we learned from each other, lifting up shared efforts, emerging strategies and connections across islands and oceans. It was an emotional time. There was laughter, tears, clarity, and aloha. These moments emerged in keynote presentations, breakout conversations, and everyday interactions over shared meals, reminding us that this work is political and personal, rooted in our own histories and personal relationships. So together we thought about land back frameworks from a global and a local lens and co-created an agenda that would weave together a commitment to story, ceremony, and strategy, realizing that returning ʻāina to the state is an ongoing commitment to a living legacy. So you can see the organizations that were represented on screen here, a ton of land trusts, a bunch of community nonprofits doing regenerative agriculture work or land restoration work or um, food sovereignty work, as well as schools and funders working on the kind of research and frameworks and resourcing to make this kind of work happen. Here you can see the results of this open space approach, facilitated by Matthew Kamakani Lynch and Miwa Tamanaha, that allowed us to co-create the summit agenda together. And they kind of said to us, there are conversations that can only be had by the people in this room. What are they? So as we shaped the agenda together, the conversations naturally kind of became deeply raw, honest, and vulnerable. And I'm just going to read out the list of kind of what came out across the categories listed in the background here across ʻEA, housing, ʻāina, finance, and any kind. So topics included water back, illegal action, ethical housing, think like an ali'i, governance is not your leadership, data sovereignty and indexing, leveraging the student workforce, sweet and salty stories, building the army, culturally empowering conservation easements, community health and land back planning, building an indigenous economy and investing across Moana Nui a Akea, show me the money and who's coming with me, food sovereignty and co-managing shared food systems, like, comment, subscribe, conflict mediation, and this one, world domination, which was this idea of how can we scale, across global scales. Um, I think what was really impactful was learning from leaders in Turtle Island or the North American continent and Aotearoa or New Zealand. So from the Bay Area, we heard from Sogorea Land Trust, a confederation of non-federally recognized tribes on Lishan territory. If you just Google land back, Sogorea will pop up. Karina Gould, their co-founder, came to share with us how they've been approaching this through a lens of rematriation. So many land trusts are dominated by men, and what does it mean to have women or two-spirit-led projects? They talked about their Shumi land tax, a voluntary land tax in the Bay Area that can fund land back projects. They shared the story of occupying the Sogorea shell mounds, a sacred site, in 2011 for 4.5 months. That this really began as an act of defiance and occupation and protest before formalizing into something more official. How they use artwork and propaganda and creative media to spread these ideas. And then they walked us through the 7 sites spanning 10 acres of urban land that have now been returned to Sogorea Land Trust that are now used for ceremony, community gardens, creek restoration, and how they've raised 30 million from the community for land purchases like the West Berkeley Shell Mound and super extremely expensive land, right? This is like San Francisco Bay Area, similar land prices to here, but that it's possible, when you have this community support. And then from Aotearoa, we heard from Maori leaders talking about cultural revitalization and the need for things like spiritual ceremony, paddling, dance. The culture and language is hand in hand with land back. Training the next generation via the university system. And then I think most relevant was learning about Panya Newton and the Ihu Mātau movement. She's depicted on the top right here. She trained to be a lawyer, but then saw her kuleana was to actually fight against this housing development and start occupying Ihumatao in 2019. She was evicted twice, but 11,000 people came. They set up 200 tents under the motto, not one more acre, right? Stolen from Maori peoples. So in 2021, the government purchased this land, this 80 acres by the airport, and has since been working with Maori leaders like Panya to create a 200-year master plan that would see the restoration of wetlands, food forests, and generate 3 times as much housing as the original development plan. So it was the way this panel was presented was quote unquote lessons from the future of like, this has already been happening with indigenous groups in other places, why not also in Hawaii? I think next I want to share about the case study of the host organization that brought us all together, the Molokai Heritage Trust. Some of you all might already be familiar with them, but for those who aren't, I'll share kind of a summary. So in the mid 2000s, Molokai Ranch, a massive employer and landholder on the island, asked the community what they would want and kind of did this massive survey effort of, do you want ahupua'a restoration, spaces for cultural practice, for fishing and farming and hunting? and then kind of revealed that they would create a land trust towards this effort, but that it would come at a cost, that it would require turning 500 acres into a gated housing community, diverting a lot of water to 200 luxury homes. So you can see on the left-hand side, La'au Point in the bottom left corner, and then this other shaded area that would be preserved as a land trust. So the community was conflicted. Many were resistant because this development would divert limited water and open the floodgates to transplants moving to Molokai and disrupting their way of life. And then others felt that this was the best deal that they were going to get. 26,000 acres is no small sum. So in 2008, protesters made it very clear that island residents would not accept this development. So, in response, Molokai Ranch shut down overnight. So, this victory came with a heavy cost. 120 jobs were lost, and it tore apart neighbors and families. Um, Fast forward to 2017, the Pule O'o Unity March, the families and generational residents of Molokai came together to heal this conflict and unite around a shared goal. Molokai Ranch listed their holdings, one-third of the island, 55,000 acres, on sale for 260 million. So the island came together to say, why not us? Why wait for a billionaire to snatch this up? Why can't we fundraise, to own one-third of our own island? So as a result, during COVID, an interim board of directors was assembled. The individuals on the right-hand side here poured 600 or 700 hours into creating their bylaws, requiring 100% consensus. They brought lawyers and funders into the mix, and recently, with support from Maui County Council, got $30 million of funding support for the Heritage Trust, as well as support from a new organization called the Global Land Restoration Fund. So this work is underway. They're now open for membership. And I think it was just a really inspiring story to see. This has been an over 20-year battle, but now we're seeing, some of the fruits of this labor, and that it's not impossible to kind of overcome interpersonal conflict. And even if you don't see eye to eye initially, that doesn't mean we can't come together later on. Some selected quotes from the summit are here. When we plan for the lifetime of a whale. Don't fight over the crumbs and forget who stole the bread. Land back is not a seat at the table, it's being put back on the map. Land is so sacred, you can't rely on old institutions to get you there. We need to revive the seed bank in our cultural kipuka, and no ʻāina is too small to reclaim. Some takeaways about the question of what is needed to advance ʻāina back in Hawaii: changing zoning to allow for housing. There was discussion of this new zoning designation called Wahipana that could allow for more flexible use. Localized gatherings like the one we're having here today, focusing specifically on our island's issues. Progressive funds that could finance this work, reframing ʻāina back as more than just cultural or environmental, but really thinking of it as an issue of sovereignty. Ike kupuna and building this into decision-making processes, training for negotiations with landowners and knowing that there will be conflict. So how do we move through conflict without losing sight of the shared goal? And also support systems for Indigenous family principles and things like data sovereignty and having kind of technical support. So that leads me to, okay, how do we apply this on Hawaii Island? So I think the good news is that it's already happening, right? There were several Hawaii Island orgs represented, not just Vibrant Hawaii, but Hawaii Land Trust, Trust for Public Land, Hulia'a Pa'a, who has several kind of member organizations like Hui Mau and Pauilo and Kahalu Kuaheva in Holualoa. But then there are also some orgs not represented doing this work on our island. I saw Beth from Kohala Community Land Trust is here with us today. Haleo Hawaii County Community Land Trust was not there. So it wasn't meant to be a kind of comprehensive, attendee list. But I think this helps me think about, okay, who was there, who wasn't there, who else is missing, right? So if there are more organizations, would love to have us talk about that in the Q&A. I think learning from neighbor islands, we heard from dozens of different organizations, but the two that really stuck out to me that are relevant for this housing coalition are PAL, Permanently Affordable Living Hawaii, and Kauai, who has secured 71 units for permanently affordable housing. They have methods in place to prioritize people who need it most, Hawaiians and generational residents. And they've created the Ho'omaluhia Community Land Trust to ensure that this land can never be put back again on the private real estate market for speculation. Below, the Lahaina Community Land Trust, we heard from their director, Autumn, sharing the 10 parcels that they've secured since the wildfires and how they're working to keep this in permanent community control as well. So I would love to see models like this kind of spread to Hawaii Island. And I know that Autumn and Larry speaking here would be really excited to speak with our coalition as well, if they haven't already, honestly. So that leads me to kind of case studies on our island. So these are recent wins that I wanted to share. If you weren't already aware, on the left-hand side, Hawaii Land Trust and Trust for Public Land worked with OK Farms to preserve 74 acres in perpetuity, which is super exciting. And on the right-hand side, Trust for Public Land helped with the creation of a Hawaiian descendant-led nonprofit to preserve 27 acres on the Kona-Kohala boundary, just south of Waikoloa Beach Resort, which is the last undeveloped beachfront parcel in this area, which is super exciting. And again, this is through the lens of kind of conservation, of restoration, of planting crops, of bringing people for educational efforts or cultural practice, but it's not about housing, right? So, in terms of housing, thinking about case studies, some of you may be familiar with this organization on the left in King's Landing in Hilo, for those calling from East Hawaii today, Malamaka ʻāina Hanaka ʻāina, who since the 1980s has been occupying DHHL land. And generations have already been born and raised there, kind of creating their own housing and taking matters into their own hands on this vacant territory. And it's been a long journey. There's news articles that come out every year. They've been on a right of entry for many years, but they have not had permits and they're not the owners of this land. They've had multiple eviction notices from DHHL. But in past years, they've been collaborating to create a land use plan pictured here that would result in 78 homestead lots eligible for DHHL beneficiaries. So I see this as a really interesting example of ʻāina back here from a housing perspective on our island that's 40 years in the making. In the middle here, we have Haleo Hawaii Community Land Trust that's been working to create affordable homeownership opportunities. They follow the typical land trust model where they own the land and you own the house. In some cases, it's a long-term lease from the county. And while they don't explicitly center ʻāina-backed principles and aren't Hawaiian-led to my knowledge, they are an example of permanently affordable housing projects here. And just over the weekend, at a work day, I learned about this new organization, Inoana EV, um, with an ʻāina-backed framework that's supporting families raise down payments to purchase homes. So just a few months ago, they raised 170,000 for their pilot project supporting a family in Puna to purchase their home and want to continue fundraising with this model to support more Hawaiian families. So there are things happening here, and part of the question is, how do we pour fuel on this fire, or think about redirecting resources and